Ethan Hayes believed the truest measure of a man was what he was willing to sacrifice for those he loved. He had built his life around this principle, a quiet philosophy that guided his hands as an architect and his heart as a husband. He thought that giving a part of himself, literally a lobe of his own lung, to save his wife Clara was the ultimate expression of that love. He thought it was a bond that could never be broken. He was wrong. What he didn't know was that while he lay recovering, the breath in his remaining lung, ragged and shallow, the space he'd created in his own body was being mirrored by a space being created in his own home. Within 2 weeks, the scar on his side would be a fresh, angry red, and the indentation on his side of the bed would be filled by another man. The ultimate sacrifice, it turned out, was merely the prologue to the ultimate betrayal. This story is about the quiet strength that lies beneath perceived weakness and the devastating consequences of underestimating the person who gave you everything. It's a journey of pain, patience, and the slow, methodical reclamation of justice. I hope you'll stick with me for it. And if this story resonates with you, I'd be so grateful if you'd hit that like button and subscribe for more tales of justice and vindication. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see how far these stories travel. Now, let's begin. The hospital room smelled of antiseptic and wilting flowers. Ethan's world had been reduced to this sterile white box for 10 days. Every breath was a conscious effort, a sharp, pulling sensation along the line of staples that held his right side together. The doctors called the surgery a resounding success. Clara's body had accepted the transplant without issue. Her rare, degenerative lung disease, which had been slowly suffocating her for years, was now in retreat. His lung was now her lung. Her breath was now his gift. He would trace the faint outline of his own ribs, imagining the new emptiness inside him, and feel a strange sense of pride. He had given her air. He had given her a future. Clara had been discharged 3 days before him. She'd been effusive in her gratitude at first, her eyes, the color of a summer sky, filled with tears as she held his hand. "You saved me, Ethan," she had whispered, her voice still hoarse. "You gave me my life back." He had simply squeezed her hand, too weak to say much, believing the action spoke louder than any words could. He had watched her walk out of his room, her steps steadier than they had been in years, and felt a profound, aching joy. It had all been worth it. His own recovery was slower, more arduous. The surgeons had to navigate a more complex extraction, and the pain was a constant, unwelcome companion. When the day of his discharge finally arrived, he felt a tremor of pure relief. He imagined sinking into his own bed, the familiar comfort of his home, Clara's presence a soothing balm. His father-in-law, Richard, was the one who came to pick him up. This was the first small, discordant note in the symphony of his homecoming. Richard was a man carved from granite in disapproval. Tall, impeccably dressed with a patrician nose that always seemed to be looking down on something, usually Ethan. He ran a successful private equity firm, a world of aggressive acquisitions and cold calculations that stood in stark contrast to Ethan's more creative, deliberate profession as a niche architect specializing in sustainable, integrated design. Richard had never fully approved of his daughter marrying a man who drew pretty buildings for a living. Clara was feeling a bit tired, Richard said by way of explanation, not even offering to help Ethan with his small overnight bag. "The recovery takes a lot out of you, you know, even for the recipient." Ethan nodded, the simple motion sending a jolt of pain through his side. "Of course, I'm just glad she's resting." He shuffled toward the car, each step a careful negotiation with his own body. The seatbelt felt like a band of hot iron across his chest. The ride home was filled with a tense silence, punctuated only by Richard's unsolicited advice. "You'll need to be careful not to be a burden on her, Ethan," he said, his eyes fixed on the road. "She's the one who needs to be looked after now. Your part in this is, well, it's done. Time for her to focus on getting her strength back. No distractions. The implication was clear. Ethan was a distraction, a complication. The man who had just undergone major surgery to save his daughter's life was being framed as a potential liability. Ethan didn't respond. He focused on the familiar streets of their quiet, affluent suburb, the manicured lawns and stately homes. He had designed 3 of the houses on their street, a fact he rarely mentioned. His work wasn't about ego. It was about creating spaces where life could flourish. He had poured that same ethos into his marriage. When they pulled into the driveway of their large, modern home, a house Ethan himself had designed from the ground up, a project of love and precision, he felt a pang of longing. Home. But the house was dark. No lights on to welcome him. It was late afternoon, but a gloom seemed to have settled over the property. "I'll just drop you here," Richard said, not even putting the car in park. "I've got a call. You have your key, I assume?" Ethan nodded, fumbling in his bag. "Yes, thank you for the ride, Richard." Richard just grunted in response, waiting until Ethan was clear of the vehicle before speeding off, the sound of his expensive engine tearing the quiet air. Ethan stood for a moment on the pristine cobblestone driveway, leaning against the cool metal of his own mailbox for support. The house stood before him, a structure of glass, cedar, and steel. His masterpiece. It looked cold, unwelcoming. He took a deep, painful breath and began the slow walk to the front door. The key turned smoothly in the lock. The house was silent, eerily so. "Clara?" he called out, his voice weaker than he expected. "I'm home." No answer. Only the faint, rhythmic hum of the refrigerator. He dropped his bag by the door and moved slowly through the open-plan living space. Everything was immaculate, cleaner than usual. Clara's things were perfectly arranged, her favorite cashmere throw folded on the sofa, a stack of fashion magazines on the coffee table. But something was off. A scent. It was faint but unmistakable. A man's cologne he didn't recognize. It was sharp, citrusy, and utterly alien in his home. A cold dread, colder than the post-operative chill he'd been fighting for days, began to creep up his spine. He told himself he was being paranoid. It could be anyone, a friend who had visited, a delivery person, Richard. But he knew Richard's scent, a heavy, musky odor that clung to his suits. This was different, younger, more modern. He made his way toward the master bedroom at the back of the house. The door was slightly ajar. As he got closer, he heard a sound, a low murmur of voices. A man's voice, then Clara's, followed by a soft laugh. The sound was intimate, familiar, the kind of laugh she used to share only with him. His heart began to pound, a frantic, painful drum against his bruised ribs. He pushed the door open, and the world fell away. The scene before him was a tableau of betrayal so perfect, so complete, it felt like a staged play. The curtains were drawn, casting the room in a dim, conspiratorial light. Clara was propped up against the headboard, wearing one of his old t-shirts, and lying next to her, on his side of the bed, his head resting casually on his pillow, was a man. He was handsome in a slick, commercial way, with perfectly coiffed hair and a smug, easy smile. He was holding Clara's hand. They both looked up as the door swung open. There was no shock on Clara's face, no guilt, only a flicker of annoyance, as if he were a servant who had interrupted a private moment. "Ethan," she said, her voice flat, "I didn't expect you home so soon." The man beside her didn't move. He just watched Ethan, his eyes filled with a kind of lazy amusement. The air left Ethan's lungs, or what was left of them, in a silent, agonizing rush. He gripped the doorframe, his knuckles turning white. The clean, sharp line of his scar felt as though it had been ripped open anew. He had imagined this homecoming 1,000 times. He had pictured tears, embraces, a quiet celebration of their shared victory over death. He had never, in his wildest, most fevered nightmares, imagined this. "What?" The word was a dry rasp, a fragment of his shattered reality. Clara sighed, a sound of profound impatience. "Ethan, don't make a scene. This is Julian." Julian gave a small, condescending wave from the bed. "Hey man, heard a lot about you." The casualness of it was a physical blow. "Heard a lot about you." He was lying in Ethan's bed, next to Ethan's wife, who was alive because of a piece of Ethan's body, and he was acting as if they were being introduced at a cocktail party. Ethan's gaze shifted from Julian back to Clara. He searched her face for any sign of the woman he had married, the woman he had loved enough to let a surgeon's scalpel carve him open. He found nothing. Her sky-blue eyes were as cold and distant as a winter horizon. "2 weeks, Clara," he whispered, the words barely audible. "It's been 2 weeks." She had the audacity to look offended. "My recovery has been very stressful. Julian has been a wonderful support." A wonderful support. The phrase hung in the air, grotesque and obscene. Ethan had been her support. He had held her when she cried, researched specialists, mortgaged a part of his soul to anxiety and fear for 2 years. He had given her his lung. And Julian, this preening stranger, had supported her by warming his side of the bed. The pain in his side flared, white-hot and blinding, but it was nothing compared to the agony in his chest. He felt a wave of dizziness, the sterile white walls of the hospital room seeming to rush back in on him. He saw the wilting flowers, heard the beep of the monitors. He had been so focused on saving her life, he had never once stopped to consider if she was a life worth saving. "Get out," Ethan said, his voice finding a sliver of strength. He was looking at Julian. Julian just smirked and looked at Clara, as if for permission. Clara's expression hardened. "Don't you dare talk to him that way, Ethan. This is my house, and you are in no position to be giving orders." My house. The words, so possessive, so dismissive, were another stab. This house, which he had sketched on napkins in a coffee shop, dreaming of the life they would build within its walls. This house whose every beam and joint he had overseen, whose mortgage was paid by the fruits of his quiet, unshowy labor. My house. He looked at them one last time, the triumphant invalid and her handsome consort lounging on the throne of their betrayal. He didn't shout, he didn't scream. The architect in him, the part that understood structure and stress points, knew that a collapse was coming, and it would not be his. Without another word, he turned around. He walked out of the bedroom, pulling the door closed with a soft, final click. He walked back through the silent living room, past the perfectly folded throw in the magazines. He picked up his bag, opened the front door, and stepped back out into the cold afternoon air. He did not know where he was going. He only knew he could not breathe in that house anymore. The air in there, the air he had fought so hard to give her, had become poison. And as he walked away from the home he had built, leaning heavily on a strength he didn't know he possessed, a new plan began to form in the quiet, methodical corners of his mind. A blueprint for a different kind of structure. Not a home, but a reckoning. Ethan found a room in a nondescript extended-stay hotel downtown. It was beige and impersonal, a purgatory of muted colors and generic art. But it was quiet, and the air was his own. For the first 2 days, he did little more than lie in bed, his body screaming in protest with every movement, his mind a maelstrom of shock and grief. The betrayal was a physical entity, a second wound that ran deeper than the surgeon's cut. He would wake up gasping, not from pain, but from the memory of that scene in the bedroom. Clara's dismissive gaze, Julian's smug smile. He had given her his lung. The phrase looped in his head, a mantra of his own foolishness. It wasn't just an organ. It was a symbol of his absolute commitment, a testament to a love he believed was reciprocal. To see it treated as such a trifle, a mere prelude to an affair, was to have the very foundation of his life pulverized. He felt like one of his own buildings after a demolition, a heap of rubble and dust where a proud structure once stood. On the third day, the grief began to recede, replaced by a cold, clear anger. It was the anger of an engineer who sees a fatal flaw in a design. The flaw wasn't in his love or his sacrifice. The flaw was in his assessment of Clara. He had seen her as a partner, an equal. She had seen him as a resource, a stepping stone, a provider of comfort, security, and, ultimately, organs. He sat up in bed, the movement sending a familiar fire across his torso. He reached for his laptop. The quiet, unassuming architect, the man Richard derisively called a drawer of pretty buildings, had a secret. It was a secret he had kept for years, not out of deceit, but out of a desire for a simple life. Ethan Hayes was not just a successful architect. He was a phenomenally wealthy one. Years ago, early in his career, he had developed a proprietary software for modeling environmental and structural stress on complex building designs. It was revolutionary, predicting material fatigue and energy consumption with unprecedented accuracy. He had sold the core technology to a major international engineering firm for a sum that had staggered him. But instead of changing his lifestyle, he had made a choice. He funneled the money into a blind trust managed by his old college roommate and trusted financial advisor, David Chen. He continued to run his small, boutique architectural firm, taking on only the projects that inspired him. He lived comfortably, but not lavishly. He wanted to be valued for who he was, not what he had. He wanted Clara to love Ethan the architect, not Ethan the multimillionaire. It seemed, in a horribly ironic twist, she had loved neither. She had only loved what he could provide. He opened a secure messaging app and typed a message to David. "We need to talk. The contingency plan is now active." David's reply came within minutes. "I'm sorry to hear that, my friend. What do you need?" "An audit," Ethan typed, his fingers moving with a new sense of purpose. "Everything. The house, the accounts, the investments Clara's father is tied into. I want a full-spectrum financial and legal analysis. I want to know exactly where every single one of my dollars is." "Consider it done," David replied. "I'll have a preliminary report for you in 48 hours. Are you safe?" "Yes," Ethan wrote back. "And for the first time in a long time, I can breathe." Over the next few days, a new routine emerged. In the mornings, Ethan focused on his physical recovery. He did the breathing exercises the doctors had prescribed, pushing through the pain, feeling his remaining lung grow stronger. He took slow, deliberate walks around the city block, each day venturing a little farther. He was rebuilding his body. In the afternoons, he was rebuilding his life. He and David communicated through encrypted channels. The information that flowed back was staggering and infuriating. Clara, it turned out, had been spending with abandon. Lavish shopping sprees, undocumented cash withdrawals, significant sums transferred to an account Ethan didn't recognize, an account that, with a little digging, was traced back to Julian Croft. Julian, it appeared, was an aspiring lifestyle entrepreneur with expensive tastes and no visible means of support. He had been a parasite on Ethan's generosity long before he'd made himself comfortable in Ethan's bed. But the most damning information concerned Richard. Clara's father's firm, Sterling Equity, had been struggling. 2 years ago, on the verge of a major collapse, Richard had come to Ethan, not for a handout, but for an investment opportunity. He'd presented a portfolio for a new tech company he was acquiring. Ethan, wanting to help Clara's family, had agreed. Through David, he had anonymously invested a substantial sum, enough to not only save Sterling Equity, but make it one of the most talked-about firms on the street. Richard had no idea where the money had come from. The investment was made through a shell corporation David had set up. Richard had boasted for months about his own genius in spotting the opportunity, his arrogance blinding him to the fact that his quiet, unimpressive son-in-law was the one who had saved his entire legacy. Ethan now effectively owned a controlling interest in his father-in-law's pride and joy. The pieces were all there, a complex blueprint of deceit and entitlement. Ethan saw the whole structure now. Clara, believing the wealth was her birthright through her father, had felt entitled to a lifestyle beyond what Ethan's visible income provided. She saw his quiet work as a failure to keep up. She had found a man, Julian, who matched her ambition for glamour, and had been using Ethan's money to fund their romance. And Richard, the patriarch, stood at the top, dispensing condescension while unknowingly living on the fruits of the very man he disdained. During this time, Clara's calls and texts started. At first they were angry. "Where are you, Ethan? You can't just walk out. We need to talk about this." Then they became manipulative. "I'm still recovering, you know. The stress you're causing isn't good for my health, for our lung." That last one almost made him throw the phone against the wall. Our lung. She was weaponizing his sacrifice against him. He didn't reply to any of them. His silence was a wall she could not breach, and it infuriated her. One afternoon, about a week after he'd left, a text came from a number he didn't recognize. "This is Julian. Listen, man, Clara is really upset. Whatever you're trying to prove, it's not working. You need to come home and sort this out like an adult. We can all be civil about this." Ethan stared at the message, a slow, cold smile spreading across his face. We. They saw themselves as a unit, a team, and he was the problem to be managed. They had no idea they were mice trying to negotiate with a sleeping lion. He had a small, worn leather key fob in his pocket. It didn't belong to a car or a house. It belonged to a private office he maintained in a different part of the city, the one place that was entirely his, where the full scope of his work and his wealth was managed. It was his symbolic object, the physical representation of his hidden power. He would hold it in his hand during the long nights in the hotel, its smooth leather a comforting weight. It was a reminder that while they thought he was adrift and broken, he was actually anchored to a bedrock of power they couldn't even comprehend. He knew a confrontation was inevitable, but it would be on his terms, in a place of his choosing, and it would not be a negotiation, it would be a demolition. He had spent his life building things. Now it was time to tear something down. He sent a single, final text back to Clara's phone. "I will be at the house tomorrow at 3 p.m. to collect my things. Please be there. We have things to discuss." He knew they would interpret this as a sign of surrender. They would see it as him coming back, tail between his legs, to beg for scraps from his own table. He needed them to think that. Arrogance was the fatal flaw in their design, and he was about to apply a catastrophic amount of pressure right on that weak point. Tomorrow, the architect would become the wrecking ball. The days leading up to the confrontation were a study in escalating arrogance from Clara and her circle. His single text message, confirming his return to the house, had been interpreted exactly as he'd predicted, as capitulation. Clara's tone shifted from manipulative concern to triumphant condescension. "I'm glad you've decided to be sensible, Ethan," she texted. "Julian and I will be here. We can discuss the terms of your moving out. I'll be generous, of course, considering your contribution." The casual cruelty of it still had the power to sting, but the pain was now a whetstone, sharpening his resolve. Every insult, every dismissal of his sacrifice, was another line item on the invoice he was preparing to deliver. His father-in-law, Richard, also felt compelled to weigh in. He left a voicemail on Ethan's phone, his voice dripping with false magnanimity. "Ethan, Richard here. Clara tells me you're coming to your senses. Good man. It's for the best. Frankly, you were never quite up to her level, and it's a relief that we can all move on. Don't worry about being put out on the street. I'll make sure you have enough for a deposit on a small apartment somewhere. It's the least I can do." Ethan saved the voicemail. It was a perfect encapsulation of Richard's character, a man offering charity that was, in reality, funded by the person he was pitying. The dramatic irony was so thick, Ethan could almost taste it. He spent his final day in the hotel preparing. David had sent over the complete dossier. It was a thick, meticulously organized binder, with color-coded tabs and executive summaries. It detailed every asset, every account, in every legal vulnerability. There were copies of the deed to the house, which was solely in Ethan's name, purchased years before the marriage. There were the statements from the joint account, showing Clara's outrageous spending and the transfers to Julian. And most importantly, there was the documentation for the shell corporation, Prometheus Innovations, that held the controlling interest in Richard's firm, Sterling Equity, complete with the paperwork that would allow Ethan to transfer that control at a moment's notice. David called him that morning. "Are you ready for this, Ethan? Emotionally, I mean. This is going to be brutal." Ethan looked at his reflection in the hotel room's dark television screen. He looked thinner, and the ordeal had carved new lines around his eyes. But his gaze was steady. The weakness was gone, replaced by a quiet intensity. "I'm not the man who went into that hospital, David. They took that man and hollowed him out. They get to deal with what's left." "All right," David said, his voice firm. "I'll be on standby. I have my instructions. The moment you give the word, the transfers will be initiated. The notifications will be sent to every board member at Sterling Equity. The entire financial world will know who holds the power before Richard even finishes his coffee tomorrow." "Thank you, David, for everything." "That's what friends are for," David replied. "Now go give them hell, theatrically, if possible." Ethan allowed himself a small, grim smile. "I'm an architect. I appreciate good structure." He dressed carefully for the meeting. Not in a suit, that would be too obvious. He chose a simple, well-made dark sweater and gray trousers. He looked like himself, the quiet architect. He wanted the visual contrast to be as stark as possible when the truth came out. He slipped the leather key fob into his pocket, its familiar weight a silent promise. He took a taxi to the house, arriving at precisely 3 p.m. As he walked up the driveway, he could see them waiting for him through the large glass front of the house. Clara, Julian, and Richard, a united front. They were seated in the living room, arranged like a panel of judges. Clara was in the center, looking regal and composed. Julian was beside her, a proprietary arm draped over the back of her chair. Richard stood near the fireplace, one hand in his pocket, radiating smug authority. Ethan paused at the door, took one last deep breath, a breath that was now entirely his own, and walked inside. The atmosphere was thick with tension and a cloying sense of superiority. "Ethan," Clara said, her voice cool and level. "Thank you for coming. Please have a seat." She gestured to a single, hard-backed chair they had placed opposite the main sofa, like a defendant's seat in a courtroom. Ethan ignored the chair. He remained standing, a silent, solitary figure in the center of the vast room he had designed. His quiet defiance immediately unsettled them. They expected a supplicant, but he wasn't behaving like one. "I'm not here to sit," he said, his voice calm and even, betraying none of the turmoil of the past weeks. "I'm here to collect my things, as I said, and to clarify a few points." Richard scoffed. "Clarify? I think things are perfectly clear. You'll be leaving. Clara will be staying. The question is simply how much of a fuss you intend to make about it." "Let's start with the house," Ethan said, his gaze sweeping over the room, the high ceilings, the carefully chosen materials. "Clara, in one of your texts, you referred to this as my house. I think that's the first point we need to clarify." He reached into the inner pocket of his jacket and pulled out a single folded document. He walked over to the large marble coffee table and placed it down. It was a copy of the deed. "This is the deed to 124 Willow Creek Lane," he said. "As you can see, the sole owner is Ethan Hayes. It was purchased 2 years before we were married, with funds from my personal accounts. This has never been your house, Clara. It has always been my house. You have been living here as my guest." Clara's composure cracked. A flash of genuine shock crossed her face before being replaced by anger. "That's ridiculous. We chose this house together." "No," Ethan corrected gently. "I designed this house. I built this house. I paid for this house. You chose the color of the guest bathroom towels. There is a significant difference. Julian, sensing Clara's distress, decided to step in. Hey man, there's no need for that. We can work out a buyout. Clara is entitled to her share. Ethan turned his gaze to Julian for the first time. It was a cold, dismissive look. You must be Julian, the wonderful support. You are a guest in my home. You are not a party to this conversation. You are, however, a party to a different conversation we will be having shortly. It involves wire fraud. Julian's smug expression vanished. The color drained from his face. I don't know what you're talking about. You will, Ethan said simply, before turning his attention to Richard, who was now watching him with a narrow, calculating expression. The initial smugness was gone, replaced by a predator's wariness. Richard, Ethan said, you were kind enough to offer me a deposit on a small apartment. I appreciate the sentiment, misplaced as it is, but I think you have more pressing concerns than my living arrangements. He reached into his pocket again and pulled out his phone. He tapped the screen, bringing up a single name. Prometheus Innovations. Does that name mean anything to you? Richard's face was a mask of confusion. It's one of our holding companies, a silent partner. What about it? It's not a silent partner, Ethan said, his voice dropping slightly, drawing them in. It's me. 2 years ago, when Sterling Equity was about to become Sterling Insolvency, you were saved by a massive, anonymous injection of capital. That capital came from me. I own 51% of your company, Richard. I have for 2 years. You've been working for me this whole time. The silence that followed was absolute. It was as if the air had been sucked out of the room. Richard stared at him, his mouth slightly agape. The edifice of his pride, the granite certainty he had worn his whole life, was crumbling in real time. That's impossible, Richard stammered. Ethan made a single call on his phone. He put it on speaker. David, are you there? I'm here, Ethan. David's crisp voice filled the room. Have the notifications been sent? As of 5 minutes ago, David confirmed. The board of Sterling Equity, along with their legal counsel and the SEC, have all been formally notified of the change in controlling interest from Prometheus Innovations to a personal holding in the name of Ethan Hayes. They have also received a preliminary report on potential financial mismanagement under Richard Sterling's leadership. I believe Richard's company phone should be getting quite active any moment now. As if on cue, a phone buzzed violently on the mantelpiece. Richard's phone. It buzzed again and again. A cascade of notifications, each one a hammer blow against the walls of his collapsing world. He looked at the phone, then back at Ethan, his face a canvas of dawning horror. This was the moment, the quiet before the storm was over. The storm had just made landfall, and it was devastating. The power dynamic in the room hadn't just shifted, it had been inverted with surgical precision. Ethan stood in the center of the chaos he had unleashed, calm and resolute. He was no longer the victim. He was the architect of their ruin. The fallout was immediate and catastrophic. Richard, pale and trembling, finally staggered over to the mantelpiece and picked up his phone. His thumb swiped across the screen, his eyes scanning the flood of messages. He sank into a nearby armchair, the phone slipping from his grasp and clattering onto the hardwood floor. The sound was unnaturally loud in the stunned silence. My board, my partners, he whispered, looking at Ethan with a mixture of terror and disbelief. What have you done? I haven't done anything, Richard, Ethan replied, his voice devoid of malice, stating a simple fact. I have simply revealed what was already there. You built your career on a foundation you didn't own, and you were too arrogant to ever look down. He then turned his full attention back to Clara. She was staring at him as if seeing him for the first time. The annoyance, the condescension, the pity, it was all gone, replaced by a dawning, frantic fear. The quiet, boring architect she had discarded was suddenly the most powerful person she had ever known. Her entire world, The world of status and wealth she craved was held in his hand. "My house," Ethan repeated softly, letting the words hang in the air. "My company, which funds your father's lifestyle. And as it turns out, my money, which has been funding yours." He gestured toward Julian, who looked as if he wanted the floor to swallow him whole. "I have bank statements, Clara, documenting over $80,000 transferred from our joint account to Mr. Crofts over the last 6 months. Since he has no official role in any of my businesses, and since you are not authorized to make such unilateral expenditures, the bank has already flagged these as potentially fraudulent. I can press charges. Or not. That depends on how the rest of this conversation goes." Julian shot to his feet. "This is a misunderstanding. Clara was just helping me with a business venture." "Was she?" Ethan asked, his eyebrow raising slightly. "And was it also a business venture when you used a credit card, which I pay for, to purchase a $2,000 watch 2 days after I was admitted to the hospital for surgery? The surgery, I remind you, that was saving your business partner's life." This was a detail David had uncovered that morning. It was petty, but its cruelty was exquisite. He had been fighting for his life, and they had been celebrating with his money. Clara finally found her voice, but it was not the confident, cutting tone from before. It was thin, reedy, and laced with panic. "Ethan, please, we can talk about this. There's no need for all of this." "All of this?" Ethan echoed. "What exactly is all of this, Clara? Is it the truth? Is that what you find so unpleasant?" He took a step closer, his quiet presence suddenly immense, dominating the room. This was the moment for his list of grievances. "Let's be very clear about what has happened here," he began, his voice low but carrying to every corner of the silent space. "For 2 years, I watched the woman I love fade away. I spent every waking moment trying to find a way to save you. I put my career on hold. I endured the condescension of your father, who saw me as nothing more than a temporary inconvenience. And then, when the only option left was to give you a piece of my own body, I did it without a second's hesitation. I let them cut me open and take a part of me to give you a future." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. His hand instinctively went to his side, over the faint ridge of his scar. "And how did you repay that? While I was in a hospital bed, learning how to breathe again, you were in this house, with him. You didn't visit me once in my last 3 days there. You sent your father to pick me up like I was a package to be delivered. You didn't even have the decency to change the sheets on my side of the bed." Each sentence was a hammer blow. He wasn't shouting, but the controlled intensity of his delivery was more devastating than any rage. He was holding up the moral mirror, and the reflection was hideous. "You took my sacrifice, the most profound gift I had to give, and you treated it like a transaction. You thought, the debt is paid, he has served his purpose, now I can have what I really want. You saw my love as a service, you saw my body as a commodity, and you saw me as disposable." Tears were now streaming down Clara's face. They were not tears of remorse, but tears of fear. The beautiful, untouchable queen had been dethroned, and she had no idea how to function as anything else. "Ethan, I'm sorry," she sobbed. "I wasn't thinking. The recovery, the stress, I made a terrible mistake." "A mistake is forgetting to pick up milk from the store, Clara," Ethan said, his voice like ice. "A mistake is taking a wrong turn. Inviting another man into your husband's bed 2 weeks after he gave you his lung is not a mistake. It is a choice. It is a reflection of your character, or the lack thereof." He turned to Julian. "You have 60 seconds to get out of my house. Leave your new watch on the table. If you are still here when I count to 60, I will make one phone call and you will spend the next year explaining to federal investigators what a lifestyle entrepreneur does." Julian didn't need 60 seconds. He scrambled for the door, fumbling with the clasp of the watch, and throwing it onto the coffee table as if it were on fire. He didn't even look back at Clara. He was gone, a coward fleeing a sinking ship. Now it was just the three of them, the architect, the broken tycoon, and the unfaithful wife. "So here is what will happen now," Ethan said, the conversation now moving from revelation to instruction. "You, Clara, will pack a bag. You will be out of this house in 1 hour. You can take your clothes and your personal effects. Anything you purchase with my money in the last 6 months stays. My lawyer will be in touch with a divorce settlement. It will be exactly what the law requires and not a penny more. You will not get this house. You will not get a share of my company. You will not get a share of your father's company, because as of tomorrow morning, I will be dissolving his board and restructuring it from the ground up. He will be given a severance package, and that is all." Richard made a choking sound from his chair. "You can't. My name, my legacy." "Your legacy is a lie you've been telling yourself for 2 years, Richard," Ethan said without even looking at him. "Your name is now attached to a cautionary tale about arrogance. You should be grateful I'm not suing you for gross mismanagement." He looked back at Clara. Her face was a mask of utter devastation. The life she had built, the life she had taken for granted, had been dismantled in less than 15 minutes. "You underestimated me, Clara," Ethan said, the final quiet bomb. "You and your father. You looked at my quiet nature and saw weakness. You looked at my profession and saw inadequacy. You looked at my love and saw leverage. You never once bothered to look at the man. And now you have to live with the consequences of that blindness." He walked over to the front door, feeling a profound sense of exhaustion, but also a clean, sharp sense of release. He had done it. The structure of their deceit was in ruins. "1 hour, Clara," he said, before opening the door and walking out into the late afternoon sun. He didn't look back. He knew what he would see, the rubble of a life that was no longer his problem. The air outside was fresh and clean, and for the first time in a long time, he could breathe without pain. The hour Ethan gave Clara was a gift of mercy she did not deserve. He didn't wait around to watch her scurry away. He went to a small park nearby, a place with old-growth trees and winding paths he had often walked before the surgery. He sat on a bench, the cool metal a stark contrast to the maelstrom of the past hour, and simply watched the world go on. Children laughed on a playground, a dog chased a frisbee, an elderly couple walked hand in hand. Life. It was all still here. His life had been derailed, but the world had not stopped turning. He felt a strange emptiness. The righteous anger that had fueled him for weeks had been spent. The confrontation, as climactic as it was, had not brought him joy. It had brought him a grim, sober satisfaction. It was the feeling an architect gets not when a building is completed, but when a condemned, unsafe structure has been safely demolished, clearing the way for something new. It was a necessary destruction. His phone buzzed. It was David. "It's done," Ethan said, his voice tired. "I saw the aftermath," David's voice came through, filled with a mixture of awe and concern. "The network is on fire. Richard Sterling's career is over. It's already the lead story on 3 financial news sites. Corporate raider devoured by secret shareholder. They're calling you the ghost of Sterling equity." Ethan let out a dry, humorless laugh. "I was a ghost in my own marriage. It seems fitting." "How are you really?" David asked, his tone softening. "I'm clear," Ethan said after a moment's thought. "The fog is gone. I see everything for what it was, and I know what I have to do next." When he returned to the house an hour and a half later, it was silent once more. A single suitcase was gone from the bedroom closet. On the kitchen counter was a set of keys in a plain white envelope. Inside the envelope was her wedding ring and a single, hastily scribbled note. "I'm sorry," it read. Ethan looked at the 2 words. Sorry. It was such a small word for such a monumental betrayal. Was she sorry for the affair? Or was she sorry she got caught? Sorry she had miscalculated so badly. He suspected it was the latter. He dropped the note and the ring into the kitchen trash can. It was a symbolic act. He was throwing away the last remnants of the lie he had been living. The days that followed were filled with the methodical process of disentanglement. Lawyers were engaged, accounts were frozen and audited, and the formal proceedings of the divorce began. Clara, stripped of her access to Ethan's wealth and her father's influence, was adrift. She tried to fight the divorce settlement, hiring a high-powered attorney with the last of her accessible funds. But the evidence was insurmountable. The pre-purchase of the house, the clear documentation of Ethan's private wealth, the proof of her infidelity and financial misconduct. Her case was hopeless. Her lawyer advised her to accept the initial offer, which was, as Ethan had promised, exactly what the state mandated. No more, no less. It was enough to live on, but not enough to sustain the life of luxury she felt was her due. Richard fared far worse. The public humiliation of his ousting was total. Ethan, as the new controlling owner of the firm, which he promptly renamed Phoenix Holdings to symbolize a rebirth from the ashes, made no public statements about Richard's character. He simply presented the facts of the company's near collapse and the anonymous bailout to the new board. The narrative wrote itself. Richard Sterling was not a visionary. He was a reckless gambler who had been saved by a ghost he had unknowingly insulted and belittled for years. His reputation was shattered beyond repair. He lost his seat on multiple corporate boards. His club memberships were quietly revoked, and the friends who had once clamored for his attention now crossed the street to avoid him. Poetic justice, Ethan thought. Richard had judged him on appearances and status, and now he had lost all of his own. As for Julian, he vanished. Once the threat of federal fraud charges was made clear, he disappeared from the social scene he so desperately wanted to conquer. A private investigator David hired found him 6 months later, working as a bartender at a resort in another country. The expensive watch and designer clothes replaced by a cheap uniform and a permanent look of bitter resentment. Ethan, meanwhile, began the slow process of rebuilding. He sold the house. As beautiful as it was tainted by memory. He couldn't walk through the living room without seeing the three of them sitting in judgment. He couldn't enter the bedroom without the ghost of that final, awful scene. He sold it to a young family, and the day he handed over the keys, he felt the last of the weight lift from his shoulders. He had built it for a life that turned out to be a mirage. Now, someone else could build a true life there. He moved into a sleek, modern apartment in the city center, with a view that stretched for miles. He poured his energy back into his work, but with a new perspective. His firm, now bolstered by the immense resources at his disposal, began taking on ambitious pro bono projects. Designing a state-of-the-art community center for an underserved neighborhood, a sustainable housing project for the homeless, a beautiful and functional new wing for a children's hospital. He found that creating spaces for others, for people who had nothing, brought him a sense of purpose that his high-end residential projects never had. He was building again, not just with steel and glass, but with compassion. About a year after the divorce was finalized, he received a letter. It was from Clara. He almost threw it away, but a flicker of curiosity made him open it. The tone was different from her last, pathetic note. It was longer, more thoughtful. She wrote that she was living in a small town a few states away, working as an assistant at a local library. She wrote about the humiliation, the loss, and the slow, painful process of realizing the truth of her own character. "I lived my life believing that what I had defined who I was," she wrote. "My father's name, the money, the beautiful house. I thought your quietness was a lack of ambition, and I resented you for it because I thought it was holding me back from the life I deserved. It never occurred to me that you had simply chosen a different set of values. You valued integrity, passion, and loyalty. I valued things. I see that now. I see that the ugliest part of my betrayal was not the affair itself, but my dismissal of your sacrifice. You gave me the gift of breath, and I used it to utter cruelties. I don't expect your forgiveness. I don't deserve it. I just wanted you to know that I finally understand what I lost. It wasn't the house or the money. it was you." Ethan read the letter twice. He felt a faint echo of the old pain, but it was distant now, like a storm long past. He didn't feel anger. He didn't feel pity. He felt a quiet sense of closure. Her understanding didn't change what she had done, but it meant that perhaps the lesson had not been entirely wasted. Perhaps she was on a path to becoming a better person. He hoped so. He folded the letter and put it away. He would not be writing back. Her journey was her own now. One evening, he was at a charity gala for the children's hospital he had helped design. He wasn't there as a donor, but as the architect, standing quietly at the back of the room, observing. He felt a light tap on his shoulder. He turned to see one of the hospital's head pediatric surgeons, a woman named Dr. Eris Thorne. She had kind, intelligent eyes and a smile that seemed genuine and warm. "Mr. Hayes," she said, "I just wanted to thank you again. The new wing it's more than just a building. The light, the space, it has a healing quality. The children feel it. We all do." "That's all I ever want my work to do," Ethan said, a real smile touching his lips. "I read a little about your design philosophy," she continued, "about building structures that support and sustain the life within them. It's a beautiful concept." They talked for a long time that night, about architecture and medicine, about purpose and passion. He found himself telling her about his surgery, framing it simply as a donation he had made. He didn't mention Clara or the betrayal. It was a part of his past, a scar that had healed, but not the story that defined him. "Doctor," Thorne listened, her expression full of empathy. "That was an incredible thing to do," she said softly, "to give someone a part of yourself like that." "I used to think so," Ethan replied, his gaze distant for a moment. "Now I think the most incredible thing is learning how to be whole again on your own." She nodded, understanding what he wasn't saying. "Well," she said, her smile returning, "from where I'm standing, you look pretty whole to me." In that moment, Ethan felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in a very long time, a sense of connection, a possibility. The demolition was complete. The ground had been cleared. The foundation for something new, something built on a bedrock of honesty and mutual respect, was finally being laid. He had lost a lung, a wife, and a life he thought he wanted, but he had gained himself, and he was finally breathing easy. The story of Ethan Hayes became a quiet legend in certain circles. In the financial world, it was a cautionary tale about the dangers of arrogance. In the legal community, it was a masterclass in strategic litigation. But for Ethan, it was simply his life. He never sought revenge in the traditional sense. He never became cruel or petty. He maintained his moral high ground, not as a tactic, but because it was the very core of who he was. Justice for him was not about punishment. It was about balance. It was about restoring an equilibrium that had been violently disrupted. Phoenix Holdings, under his guidance, flourished. He implemented a new corporate ethos focused on ethical investment and employee well-being. He divested from companies with questionable environmental or labor practices and invested heavily in renewable energy, medical technology, and education. He turned a vessel of pure greed into an engine for positive change. Richard's legacy of rapacious capitalism was systematically dismantled and replaced by a legacy of conscientious growth. It was the most elegant and complete repudiation of his father-in-law's entire worldview. He and Dr. Eris Thorne began to see each other. Their relationship was a slow burn, built on a foundation of shared values and intellectual respect. She was the first person he told the entire story to, from start to finish. He laid it all out one evening in his apartment, the city lights twinkling below like a fallen constellation. He showed her the scar, not as a mark of betrayal, but as a symbol of his own resilience. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she took his hand, her touch gentle. "You built your whole life on the idea of sacrifice," she said, "but the person you sacrificed most was yourself. You hid your success. You minimize your own needs, all in the hope that someone would love the simple you. What you learned is that true love isn't about loving a simplified version of a person. It's about loving the whole, complex, brilliant person and not being intimidated by their light. Her words resonated with a profound truth. He had been so afraid of his wealth defining him that he had allowed someone else's weakness to define him instead. Eris didn't see him as a bank account or a savior. She saw him as Ethan, the brilliant architect, the compassionate philanthropist, the man who had survived an unimaginable betrayal with his integrity intact. With her, he didn't have to hide any part of himself. His relationship with his own body also transformed. The pain from the surgery eventually faded to a dull ache, and then to nothing more than a memory. He took up swimming, the water providing a gentle resistance that helped him rebuild his strength. Lap after lap, in the quiet solitude of the pool, he found a rhythm. Breathe in, breathe out. The simple, life-affirming act he had once taken for granted was now a conscious meditation. He was alive. He was strong. He was whole. He never heard from Clara again after her letter, but David, ever the diligent friend, kept a peripheral watch. She stayed in that small town, working at the library. She never remarried. By all accounts, she lived a quiet, solitary life. There was a sadness in that, but also a sense of peace. She had been stripped of the artifice she had mistaken for identity and had been forced to confront the person underneath. Ethan hoped she had found some measure of contentment there. Redemption, he knew, was not a dramatic event, but a long, quiet process. His own story, he realized, was not about revenge. It was about reclamation. He had reclaimed his wealth, his home, his dignity, but most importantly, he had reclaimed his narrative. He was not the victim who was cheated on after giving up a lung. He was the man who built a beautiful life, saw it corrupted by greed and deceit, and had the strength and intelligence to tear it down and build something even better in its place. The final piece of the old life to be dealt with was the money, the vast fortune he had never truly wanted. With Eris's help, he established the Hayes Foundation, a charitable organization dedicated to two causes close to his heart: providing funding for innovative architectural solutions for community health, and offering financial support to the families of organ donors. It was his way of transforming his pain into a positive force, of using the resources that had been the source of so much conflict to create a legacy of healing and support. He was turning the poison into medicine. One day, years later, Ethan was walking through the new wing of the Children's Hospital. It was bright and airy, filled with colorful murals and the sound of children's laughter. He saw a young boy, no older than 10, sitting by a large window, a sketchbook in his lap, drawing the building. Ethan smiled and walked over. "That's a good drawing," he said. The boy looked up, his eyes bright. "I want to be an architect when I grow up," he said. "I want to build places that make people feel better." Ethan's heart swelled. He looked out the window at the city stretching out before him. He had built this. Not just the building, but this moment. This small spark of inspiration in a young boy's heart. He had learned that true worth is not measured by what you have, or even what you sacrifice. It's measured by what you build, what you create, and what you leave behind. It's measured by the strength of your own foundation. A foundation built not of steel or concrete, but of integrity, resilience, and the quiet, unshakable belief in your own value. And as he stood there, the sun warming his face, he took a deep, easy breath, feeling utterly and completely whole. This story is a powerful reminder that our true value is internal, not external. It's not about the money we have, the status we hold, or even the sacrifices we make for others. It's about our integrity, our resilience, and the dignity with which we face our darkest moments. Ethan's journey from devastating betrayal to quiet triumph shows us that the most powerful revenge is not to become like those who wronged us, but to rise above them and build a better life. a life founded on our own terms and our own values. What do you think is the most important lesson from Ethan's story? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Your perspective is what makes this community so special. And if you found this story of justice and reclamation meaningful, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel for more content like this. Thank you for being here and for sharing in this journey. Until next time, remember your worth and never let anyone else define it for you.